to her apron strings. Now I am so...
Country music has always worn its heartbreak honestly. It lives in the lyrics, in the cry of a pedal steel, in the long silences between verses that say more than the words ever could. But sometimes the tragedy wasn't written into a song. It arrived in the final hours of a last performance, in the parking lot after the encore, or on the dark stretch of road between the stage and home. These are 10 country singers whose final moments were forever tangled with the music they lived for. Stories of sudden loss, unfinished shows, and legacies that deserved far different endings. Number 10, Ricky Nelson, December 31st, 1985. It was New Year's Eve, and the show was waiting. A crowd in Dallas, Texas had paid for a night of music, and Ricky Nelson was on his way to give them one. He never arrived. Eric Hilliard Nelson had spent his entire life in front of an audience, which was both a gift and a complication he never fully resolved. He had grown up on television, literally as a child star on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, the family sitcom that ran throughout the 1950s and turned the Nelson household into one of the most watched in America. But music was always the real thing. His 1957 debut Single Teenager's Romance moved over 1 million copies before anyone had properly processed what was happening. He followed it with a string of clean, effortless pop rockabilly records that made him one of the best-selling artists of his era, recording at Capitol and Imperial with a backing band that included the brilliant guitarist James Burton, a musician whose fingerprints would later appear on records by Elvis Presley and Emmylou Harris. The hits kept coming. Poor Little Fool, Travelin' Man, Hello, Mary Lou. By the early 60s, he had charted over 50 singles, but as the decade turned and tastes shifted, the teen idol machinery that had built him began working against him. Audiences expected the familiar, and Nelson had grown into something more restless and genuinely musical than the image allowed. His pivot into country rock in the early 70s was not a commercial calculation. It was an honest move toward the music he actually loved. The Stone Canyon Band gave him a lean, road-worn sound rooted in Bakersfield and Nashville. And Garden Party, released in 1972, told the story of his artistic reinvention directly. A top 5 hit written after a Madison Square Garden oldies show crowd booed him for playing new material. The song was almost defiantly autobiographical. He had changed. He was not apologizing for it. By the 1980s, Nelson was touring steadily, playing the music he believed in for audiences who had followed him through every reinvention. On December 31st, 1985, he and his band boarded his converted DC-3 aircraft in Guntersville, Alabama, heading to a New Year's Eve concert in Dallas. The plane developed a fire in the rear fuselage and went down near DeKalb, Texas. Ricky Nelson was 45 years old. 6 others perished alongside him. He never made it to the stage. The crowd in Dallas waited, and then the news came through and the new year arrived without him. He had spent nearly 3 decades outgrowing every box the industry tried to put him in. Country, pop, rock, nostalgia act, reinvented artist. None of the labels ever quite fit, and maybe that was exactly the point. The music he made in those final touring years was the most honestly himself he had ever sounded. It just didn't get nearly enough time. Number 9. Buck Owens, March 25th, 2006.
My transistor radio comes from fall.
He walked off the Crystal Palace stage on the night of March 24th, 2006, and the crowd cheered the way they always did. Long, warm, and completely unhurried, like they never wanted it to end. For Buck Owens, that kind of reception was old news. He had been earning it for 50 years. Buck Owens was not just a country star, he was an architect. Alongside Don Rich and the Buckaroos, he helped invent the Bakersfield sound, a lean, electric rattle and drive approach to country music that pushed back hard against the orchestrated sweetness pouring out of Nashville. Telecasters, overstrings, honky-tonk over Hollywood. The music felt like working men playing exactly what they actually felt, and not a note more than that. Between 1959 and 1967, Owens placed 21 consecutive singles at #1 on the Billboard country charts. Axe for My Baby, Together Again, Tiger by the Tail. Each one a precision instrument. No wasted notes, no wasted sentiment, no filler. He recorded much of that material at Capitol Studios in Hollywood, working with producers who understood that what made the Bakersfield sound powerful was what it left out as much as what it put in. He stepped away from the spotlight in the early 70s, but a second wave of fame found him as co-host on Hee Haw, the beloved television variety program that ran for over 2 decades. A new generation fell in love with him all over again, this time through the television screen, watching a man who was clearly having the time of his life doing something he had been born to do. By the 2000s, Owens had settled into a comfortable rhythm at the Crystal Palace, the Bakersfield venue he owned and operated, a room built in his own image. Neon and sawdust and cold beer and loud music. It was his house. He was happiest there. After his final show on March 24th, he went home to his ranch. He went to sleep. He did not wake up. Buck Owens was 76 years old. He had performed a full show the night before he died. Not a farewell, not a tribute, just another Friday night at his place, playing the songs he loved for the people who loved him back. The Bakersfield sound never quite sounded the same without him, but he gave it everything, right up until the night the music finally stopped.
The beauty of her face was beyond my...
Number 8. Conway Twitty, June 5th, 1993.
I see the sparkling.
The last bow happened in Branson, Missouri on the evening of June 5th, 1993. Conway Twitty finished his performance at his venue, settled into his tour bus, and began the long drive home to Tennessee. He never arrived. Harold Lloyd Jenkins, the man the world knew as Conway Twitty, had been one of the most consistent hitmakers in the history of country music. His total of 55 #1 singles on the Billboard country charts stood as a record that held for decades, 55 times. He had reached the summit more often than almost anyone in any genre, in any era. He had started as a rock and roll singer in the late 50s, cutting records in the style of Elvis Presley, scoring a massive pop hit with It's Only Make Believe in 1958. It reached #1 on the pop charts in 12 countries, but his heart had always leaned closer to country. By the mid-60s, he made the switch fully and permanently, and almost immediately began stacking up chart toppers. Hello, Darlin', Tight-Fittin' Jeans. He recorded much of his material at Owen Bradley's barn in Nashville and later at MCA Studios, working with producers who understood that his voice needed room and very little else. His voice was the thing people always talked about first: deep, warm, and completely unhurried. It sounded like it knew things. When Conway Twitty sang about love or longing or the quiet ache of regret, audiences believed him completely because nothing in his delivery suggested anything other than the full, unguarded truth. After his final Branson performance, he was aboard his tour bus when he suffered a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. He was rushed to Cox Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, and underwent emergency surgery. Conway Twitty died on the evening of June 5th, 1993. He was 59 years old. The country music world went quiet in a way it rarely does. Radio stations pulled regular programming. Loretta Lynn, who had been his closest creative partner for years, was inconsolable. And in every corner of the industry, the same thought circulated quietly. That voice. What a voice to lose. He played his last show, and then he was gone. The tour bus rolled out of Branson, carrying him towards something nobody in country music was ready for. Number 7. Dottie West, September 4th, 1991.
Running through fields of daisies.
She was running late. She was always running late, her friends would later say, with the kind of tired affection that comes from knowing someone completely. But on the night of August 30th, 1991, running late became the most dangerous thing Dottie West ever did. She was due on stage at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, and her car had broken down on Interstate 65, just a few miles from the Opry House. The show was starting, the audience was waiting, and Dottie West, being Dottie West, was not willing to miss it. George Thaxton, an 81-year-old fan who happened to recognize her stranded on the side of the road, pulled over and offered her a ride. She accepted. In the rush to get her to the stage on time, Thaxton lost control of his vehicle on the ramp near the Opry, and the car struck a concrete barrier. Dottie West was airlifted to Vanderbilt University Medical Center with severe internal injuries. She held on for 5 days. She passed away on September 4th, 1991. She was 58 years old. West had been a true trailblazer in the fullest sense of the word. Her recording of Here Comes My Baby in 1964 made her the first woman in country music to win a Grammy Award. She had recorded much of her early work at RCA's Studio B on Music Row in Nashville, a room that would also give the world recordings from Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, and Chet Atkins. She followed the Grammy win with a string of solo hits and a celebrated duet partnership with Kenny Rogers in the 70s, their recordings becoming radio staples on country stations coast to coast. She had rebuilt her career more than once, Financial troubles in the 80s had cost her her home and much of what she had accumulated over a lifetime of hard work, but she kept performing. She kept showing up, night after night, because the stage was the one place where everything made sense. The Grand Ole Opry was her church. She had been performing there since 1962, nearly 30 years of Friday and Saturday nights under those warm lights, singing for audiences who adored her absolutely. She never made it back that night. The car stopped, and so did everything else. What remained was a legacy built on resilience, warmth, and a voice that never once apologized for how deeply it felt. Number 6. David Stringbean, Akeman, November 10th, 1973. By the time David Akeman walked off the Grand Ole Opry stage on the night of November 10th, 1973, the crowd had already given him everything they had. The laughter, the applause, the genuine affection of an audience that had known him for decades. They always did. Stringbean had a gift for making people feel joy that seemed entirely effortless, the kind of warmth that only accumulates after a lifetime of honest work. Akeman had been a fixture on the Opry since the 1940s. He had played alongside Bill Monroe in some of bluegrass music's foundational years, had helped shape the comic tradition of country performance, and had turned his 5-string banjo into something that could make an audience feel tickled and touched in the same breath. He wore oversized shirts with the tails hanging low and trousers that rose up past his waist, a lanky, loping visual signature that became as recognizable as any costume in country music history. He played with a loose, easy joy that made every show feel like a front porch gathering rather than a performance. He and his wife Estelle had a routine after shows. They would drive back to their farm in Goodlettsville, Tennessee, and enjoy the quiet of the property they had worked so hard to own. Stringbean was known to carry cash on his person, a habit that was widely known in Nashville circles. On the night of November 10th, 2 intruders, John Brown and Doug Brown, had broken into the farmhouse while the couple was at the Opry. When Stringbean and Estelle arrived home after the show, both were shot and killed on the property. Stringbean was 57 years old. Estelle was 54. The murders shook Nashville in a way that even decades of hindsight cannot fully soften. The Grand Ole Opry fell silent in grief, unlike any it had experienced before. Roy Acuff, who had known Akeman for nearly 30 years, wept openly and without embarrassment. So did much of the Opry family, performers and stagehands, and the men and women who had watched him work that stage for a generation. Stringbean represented something the Opry held sacred, a direct living connection to the mountain music and honest comedy traditions that had built country entertainment from the ground up. His absence left a silence in those backstage corridors that lingered for a very long time. The last sound David Stringbean Akeman heard from an audience was laughter and applause. That, at least, was exactly right. Number 5. Little Jimmy Dickens, January 2nd, 2015. He was 94 years old, rhinestones blazing under the Opry lights, and the crowd responded the way it always did, completely and without reservation. For 60 years, that stage had been his home, and everyone in the room on New Year's Eve 2014 knew they were watching something irreplaceable. James Cecil Dickens came out of Bolt, West Virginia, the 10th of 13 children in a family that measured wealth in music rather than money. Roy Acuff heard him working small Midwest radio stations and quietly put in a word. Dickens joined the Grand Ole Opry in 1948 and never really left, eventually becoming its longest-serving member in history. A living thread connecting the post-war era to the 21st century, one rhinestone suit at a time. His Columbia recordings introduced a persona nobody else could touch. Take an Old Cold Tater and Wait in 1949. May the Bird of Paradise Fly Up Your Nose hitting number 1 in 1965 and crossing into the pop top 10. A small man with enormous charisma, comic timing sharp enough to cut glass, and a voice that could pivot from self-deprecation to genuine tenderness in a single breath. The custom nudie cone suits were not costumes. They were commitments, a declaration that the audience deserved the full show every single time. He performed on New Year's Eve 2014, ringing in his final year with the crowd that had been his constant for 6 decades. 2 days later, on January 2nd, 2015, he suffered a stroke backstage at the Opry House following another appearance and was gone. He had never stopped showing up. The stage was where he belonged, and the stage was, in the end, exactly where he was, dressed in rhinestones. right up until the lights went down. Number 4. Jim Reeves, July 31st, 1964.
I love you because...
He was flying himself home. That was the thing about Jim Reeves in those years. He had reached enough, earned enough to let someone else handle the logistics, but he preferred to be in control, to hold the stick himself. On the afternoon of July 31st, 1964, somewhere above the wooded hills south of Nashville, that preference cost him everything. James Travis Reeves had spent the previous decade building one of the most distinctive and immediately recognizable sounds in country music. His voice was a baritone so round and warm it seemed to rise up from somewhere beneath the floor. He had moved his microphone closer than convention suggested, well inside the usual distance, and the result was something intimate and almost private, a recording style that became known as the Velvet Sound, and that gave everything he sang a quality of being addressed to one person specifically. He had started in radio broadcasting and then briefly in professional baseball, spending time in the minor leagues before a leg injury ended that chapter. Music had always been the real thing, and by 1953, his recording of Mexican Joe for Abbott Records in Shreveport opened a door that never fully closed again. He signed with RCA Victor and began recording at their Nashville studios, working alongside producer Chet Atkins, who understood intuitively that the most powerful thing Jim Reeves could do was sing quietly and mean every syllable. 4 Walls in 1957. He'll have to go in 1959, which became one of the best-selling country singles of the entire decade, eventually crossing over to the pop charts in a way few country records managed. He had played Carnegie Hall. He had toured Europe to enormous acclaim, particularly in Ireland and South Africa, where his music found audiences who treated him not as a novelty, but as a genuine and important artist. On that July afternoon, Reeves was piloting his single-engine Beechcraft Debonair near Nashville after a business meeting in Arkansas. He flew into a thunderstorm. Visibility dropped to nothing. The aircraft disappeared from radar and came down in dense woodland near Brentwood, Tennessee. Jim Reeves was 40 years old. His manager Dean Manuel was with him and also perished. The search took 2 days. Nashville held its breath the entire time. He had no final show, no last bow, no audience to send him off. Just the weather and the silence that followed. What he left behind was a catalog so precisely made that radio stations played it without stopping for days after the news broke. Some voices don't disappear. They just drift a little further off.
For 100 bucks.
Number 3. Patsy Cline, March 5th, 1963.
I'm crazy for feeling.
She had already given the Kansas City audience everything. The benefit show held to support the family of disc jockey Cactus Jack Call, who had recently been killed in a car accident, had gone the way Patsy Cline's performances always went. She walked to the microphone and owned the room from the first note. No warm-up, no easing in, just the voice, full and immediate, the most commanding instrument in country music. Virginia Patterson Hensley, the girl from Winchester, Virginia, had been fighting for recognition long before anyone was ready to give it to her. She had auditioned for the Grand Ole Opry as a teenager and been turned away. She had recorded sides that went nowhere. She had paid dues that would have broken a less determined person entirely. When Walkin' After Midnight arrived in 1957, a record that slipped between country and pop so naturally that neither audience felt it belonged only to the other, it was the beginning of something that had been building for years. Then I Fall to Pieces in 1961, produced by Owen Bradley at his legendary Quonset Hut studio in Nashville, became the song that separated Patsy Cline permanently from every other female voice in the industry. Crazy followed months later, a song written by Willie Nelson that she had initially resisted, feeling the melody moved too far from the straight country she trusted. She recorded it anyway, in one take after a painful fall had left her in a cast, standing propped against a music stand in the studio. And the result was something that went beyond genre entirely. Those 2 back-to-back records made her case permanently. She was not just extraordinary, she was singular. There was no one else doing what she did or doing it the way she did. After the Kansas City benefit on the night of March 3rd, 1963, she and several performers boarded a Piper Comanche aircraft piloted by Randy Hughes, her manager. Also aboard were country stars Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas. The plane encountered severe weather over Tennessee. On March 5th, 1963, it came down on a wooded hillside near Camden, Tennessee. There were no survivors. Patsy Cline was 30 years old. Owen Bradley, who had made her greatest recordings possible, described the call as the worst moment of his professional life. And in the years that followed, every female singer in country music who ever pushed against the constraints placed upon her, who ever insisted on being more than what the industry wanted her to be, has done so in her shadow, whether they knew it or not. She never got to hear what she became. That may be the most heartbreaking part of all.
And then someday.
Number 2, Johnny Horton, November 5th, 1960.
In 1814, we took a little trip.
The last thing Johnny Horton ever did was give an audience exactly what they came for. He played the Skyline Club in Austin, Texas, on the night of November 4th, 1960, and by all accounts, the crowd left satisfied. He was that kind of performer, clean and confident and completely at ease in a room, the kind of man who made it look like singing for strangers had always been the most natural thing in the world. John Gale Horton had carved out a niche that was entirely his own. History-based, honky-tonk. Big, propulsive ballads built around American mythology and frontier stories, songs that made the past feel immediate and alive. The Battle of New Orleans in 1959 was a crossover phenomenon, hitting number 1 on both the Billboard country and pop charts simultaneously. A rare double that put his name in front of audiences who had never paid attention to country radio before. It won him the Grammy Award for Best Country and Western Recording in 1960, the first year the category existed, and the honor felt entirely deserved. North to Alaska followed as the theme to the John Wayne film of the same name, and it confirmed everything the first hit had suggested. Horton had a gift for turning history into spectacle without losing the honky-tonk foundation underneath it all. He had recorded much of his work in Shreveport, Louisiana, at studios connected to the Louisiana Hayride, the beloved radio program on KWKH that had also helped launch Hank Williams, Elvis Presley, and a dozen other artists who went on to reshape American music. His personal life carried its own strange weight. He had been married to Billie Jean Williams, the widow of Hank Williams, a connection that gave him an almost mythological relationship to the shadows of country music history, as though some thread of fate had always meant to connect them. After his final show at the Skyline Club, Horton and 2 companions began the drive back to Shreveport. In the early morning hours of November 5th, a drunk driver crossed the center line on a bridge near Milano, Texas, and hit their car head-on. Johnny Horton was 35 years old. He had been afraid of dying young. Friends who knew him well said he talked about it sometimes, a quiet, recurring anxiety that followed him even in the good times. He had survived long enough to reach the top of the charts and feel the full weight of what he had accomplished. He just hadn't survived long enough to know how much further he could have gone. The Battle of New Orleans still plays on oldie stations across the country. The history he sang about outlasted him. It always does.
There wasn't as many as there was a while ago.
Number 1, Hank Williams, January 1st, 1953. He never made it to the stage. That somehow is the most country music thing about all of it. A man who had poured more honesty and heartache into 3-minute songs than most writers accumulate in a lifetime, dying in the backseat of a powder blue Cadillac on a dark stretch of West Virginia highway, on his way to a show he would never play. The most important artist country music ever produced, gone before anyone had fully understood what they had. Hiram King Williams had been born into poverty in Georgiana, Alabama, and had taught himself guitar largely from a black street musician named Rufus Payne, a man Williams called T-Tot, whose blues phrasings and raw emotional directness found their way permanently into the country music Williams would make. He had reached the Grand Ole Opry stage by 1949 after years of grinding regional work and recording first for Sterling Records and then for MGM in Nashville. And from the moment he stepped up to that Opry microphone for the first time, everyone in the room understood that something different had arrived. Something that had never quite existed before. Lovesick blues. Your cheatin' heart. I'm so lonesome I could cry. Cold, cold heart. Hey, good looking. In the span of roughly 4 years, Hank Williams wrote and recorded a catalog that rewrote what country music believed itself capable of. The songs were elemental. Just voice and guitar, and the kind of radical honesty that made ordinary people feel genuinely seen, felt in their loneliness, in their longing, in their quiet, unspeakable desperation. No production tricks, no orchestration to hide behind, Just a man standing in front of a microphone at Castle Studio in Nashville, saying the exact thing that nobody else had been brave enough to say plainly. He had been dismissed from the Grand Ole Opry in 1952 due to chronic unreliability, a term that barely covered the real story. A degenerative spinal condition had caused him real, constant, debilitating pain since his teenage years. And the alcohol and pain medications he had turned to for relief had become something he could no longer manage or contain. The Opry let him go. His marriage collapsed. The momentum of the previous years began to slip. On December 30th, 1952, his driver Charles Carr left Montgomery, Alabama, with Williams in the back seat, headed toward Canton, Ohio, where a New Year's Day performance was booked and the audience was already anticipating the show. They drove through the night. Somewhere in the dark hours of January 1st, 1953, near Oak Hill, West Virginia, Hank Williams died in the backseat of that Cadillac. He was 29 years old. The official cause was acute heart failure, attributed to the combination of alcohol and the chloral hydrate he had been given to help him rest for the journey. Carr discovered him when they stopped for gas in Oak Hill. He had been gone for hours by then. The new year had already begun without him. He had no final performance, no last song, no crowd to send him off with the kind of applause that might have felt like an ending. Just the road and the cold, and a Cadillac moving through the American dark toward a stage that would stand empty on New Year's Day.
I wouldn't let my dear say.
Country music has spent 70 years trying to process that loss. The songs he left behind have made it easier. They were always big enough to fill any silence he left behind. They still are. From the last bow of a Western swing king in Oakland to a powder blue Cadillac rolling through West Virginia in the cold dark of a new year. These are the stories that remind us what the music costs. Country has always known tragedy. It was built partly on it, forged from loss and longing and the hard truth that not everything turns out the way you hoped. But behind every name on this list was a performer who gave crowds something real, night after night, right up until the last moment they had. They didn't get the endings they deserved. But the music they left behind makes sure the rest of the story keeps getting told. If you want to keep exploring the heartbreaking and legendary corners of country history, check out our next video. More stories, more songs, and the voices that should never be forgotten. Thanks for being here.